In the final weeks of the Third Reich, as Berlin burned and Allied armies closed in from all sides, one of Hitler's most powerful ministers was apparently organizing an escape. Not to South America, not to Spain or Switzerland, to Greenland. The frozen, desolate, Allied-controlled island in the North Atlantic. Most people assume this is fiction, another wild tale from the conspiracy theory mill, like the hollow Earth nonsense or the Antarctic base myths I've explored before. Except this one? According to multiple post-war sources, it actually came close to reality, or at least to serious operational planning. While digging through declassified British intelligence files for my ongoing investigation into how Albert Speer died in London decades after the war, I stumbled across something unexpected. References to Operation Greenland, mission orders with Speer's name attached, witness testimony from pilots who'd been preparing for the mission. And here's where it gets interesting. President Trump's recent fixation on acquiring Greenland isn't just geopolitically awkward. It shines light on this forgotten chapter of World War II history. Because 80 years ago, according to surviving documentation, the Nazis had their own plans for that island. Albert Speer understood something most of the Nazi leadership refused to acknowledge in early 1945. They'd lost. As Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, Speer had access to information others didn't. Production figures, raw material inventories, casualty reports, the real numbers, not the propaganda. He'd watched the Allied bombing campaign systematically dismantle German industrial capacity. He'd seen American and British forces advancing from the west, while the Soviets ground forward from the east. The miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the super tanks, none of it mattered anymore. Germany was bleeding out, and Speer knew something else. His hands were covered in blood. The slave labor programs, the death factories masquerading as weapons production facilities. Millions worked to death under his direct authority. If captured, he faced execution, no question. So according to his later accounts, he began planning his exit. The inspiration, according to multiple post-war interrogations, including extensive debriefings by British and American intelligence officers, Speer claimed his Arctic escape plan came from an unusual source. A film, SOS Iceberg, released in 1933, starring Leni Riefenstahl before she became Hitler's favorite propagandist. The movie showed a doomed Arctic expedition, survival against impossible odds, human endurance in the frozen wasteland. Speer claimed he watched it sometime in late 1944 or early 1945. And apparently, instead of seeing a cautionary tale, he saw possibility. A place so hostile, so remote, that no one would think to look there. A place to vanish. In conversations with historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who would later write The Last Days of Hitler, Speer laid out his scheme with remarkable candor. He claimed he'd planned to take his wife Margaret, their 6 children, key ministerial staff, and a military protection detail to Greenland's eastern coast. They would establish a camp, wait out the summer, survive on pre-positioned supplies and whatever they could hunt or fish. Then, in October 1945, when the dust had settled and attention shifted elsewhere, they'd simply fly back to Germany, return to Heidelberg, resume civilian life. Trevor Roper, sitting across from this man who'd orchestrated industrial-scale death, could barely process what he was hearing. According to Trevor Roper's account, he asked whether Speer actually believed that by October the Allies would have forgotten about senior Nazi officials, that he could just reappear. Speer's reported response: he wanted those 6 months to write his memoirs, to organize his thoughts, to craft his defense. The naivete staggers the imagination. Yet according to available evidence, Speer threw real resources, real planning, real military assets at making this fantasy operational. For decades, historians treated Speer's Greenland story as delusion, the grandiose fantasy of a war criminal trying to appear clever in retrospect. After all, the idea seemed preposterous. How would they survive? How would they avoid detection? Allied aircraft and ships operated throughout those waters. American air bases dotted Greenland itself. The whole thing sounded like fever dream logic from a desperate man rewriting his own history. Until 2003. That's when someone who claimed to have actually been involved in preparations, someone who'd reportedly loaded aircraft and plotted flight paths, finally spoke publicly. And the story shifted from probable fiction to documented possibility. Ernst Kernig, aged 93, sat in his sheltered housing unit in Travemünde, northern Germany. A reporter from the Sunday Times had tracked him down after finding his name in declassified Luftwaffe personnel files. Kernig had been a Hauptmann, a captain, in the German Air Force. One of their experienced navigators, posted to the seaplane base at Travemünde in early 1945. And in April of that year, according to his 2003 testimony, his commanding officer gave him unusual orders. Prepare aircraft for extended Arctic operations. Plot routes to Greenland's eastern coast. Calculate fuel loads, supply requirements, passenger capacity. We were told to prepare for a high-value evacuation, Kernig told the newspaper. We didn't know who, just that it was ministerial level. Then, according to Kernig, equipment started arriving. Crates of it. Trucked in under military escort. Arctic survival gear. Tents designed for extreme cold. Skis, sledges, fishing equipment, rifles, medical supplies, preserved food by the ton. Everything you'd need to establish an isolated camp and keep 20 to 30 people alive for months. Kernig said he and his fellow officers worked around the clock preparing the planes. He remembered thinking, this is insane. But orders were orders. According to Kernig's account, the operation centered on one specific aircraft type, the Blohm Voss BV 222 Wiking, the largest operational flying boat of World War II. Only 13 were ever built. By April 1945, perhaps 5 remained in flyable condition, scattered across northern Germany and Norway. 3 were stationed at Travemünde. The BV 222 wasn't beautiful. It was functional, brutal efficiency in aircraft form. 37 meters from nose to tail, wingspan stretching 46 meters, 6 engines, capable of carrying 92 fully equipped troops or equivalent cargo weight. More importantly, it could land on water, on lakes, on relatively calm seas, no runway required. That solved the biggest problem with fleeing to Allied-controlled territory. You didn't need infrastructure. Just open water and reasonably calm conditions. The aircraft had proven range of 6,100 kilometers and could stay airborne for 28 hours at cruising speed. Berlin to Greenland's eastern coast, roughly 3,500 kilometers. Completely feasible with fuel to spare. Kernig claimed he and his colleagues worked out a flight plan that routed through German-occupied Norway for refueling, then struck out across the Norwegian Sea toward Greenland. German weather stations, which we'll get to, had already mapped suitable landing sites. Technically, operationally, logistically, this could work. Speer couldn't organize something like this alone. He needed expertise, military cooperation, access to aircraft and crews. According to post-war accounts, his point man was Oberst Siegfried Knemeyer, a colonel in the Luftwaffe's Technical Development Division. Knemeyer worked directly with the Air Ministry in Berlin, coordinating aircraft production and deployment. Speer and Knemeyer had worked together extensively on military aircraft projects. They knew each other well. And Knemeyer was both skilled enough and desperate enough to take on an unorthodox assignment. Speer later claimed that in mid-April 1945, he gave Knemeyer 2 tasks. First, gather all sensitive technical documents from the Air Ministry and hide them outside Berlin before Soviet forces overran the city. Second, arrange the Greenland evacuation. Knemeyer needed aircraft. That meant contacting Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Squadron. KG-200 flew captured Allied aircraft for intelligence gathering, ran covert insertions, and operated Germany's most unusual planes, including the BV-222 flying boats. The unit's commander, Oberstleutnant Werner Baumbach, was reportedly one of Knemayer's personal friends. So was the base commander at Travemünde, Oberstleutnant Lenhoff, who directly controlled the BV-222s stationed there. The network existed. The relationships were in place. The aircraft were available. According to these accounts, Speer's escape plan shifted from theoretical to operational. Now here's the piece that makes this entire story plausible rather than absurd. Germany already had operational experience in Greenland. Significant documented experience. Why weather? Meteorological information was critical for planning military operations across Europe. Weather systems move west to east across the Atlantic. If you're in Germany trying to predict tomorrow's weather for bomber operations or naval deployments, you need weather stations positioned far to the west. Greenland was perfect. Starting in 1940, Germany set up multiple weather stations along Greenland's eastern coast. Small teams, usually 6 to 10 men, would overwinter in primitive shelters, radioing weather data back to Europe. Some stations were discovered by American and Danish forces. Others ran successfully for months or even years. And when teams needed extraction, the Luftwaffe flew in. In one documented case from 1944, a Junkers Ju-290 heavy transport landed on sea ice near a weather station, loaded 26 personnel aboard, and flew them back to Norway without incident. The precedent existed. The Germans knew those coastlines. They'd mapped landing sites. They understood ice conditions, seasonal patterns, resource availability. In July 1944, a BV-222 flew over eastern Greenland, dropping spare parts and supplies to one weather station before returning to base. This mission is documented in Luftwaffe records. So when Speer proposed establishing a temporary camp there, it wasn't pulling the idea from nowhere. Germans had been operating in Greenland throughout the war. One more small camp wouldn't necessarily raise immediate alarm, at least not before they could dig in. Back to the timeline, April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. The Nazi leadership gathered in the bombed-out Reich Chancellery in Berlin for what everyone understood would likely be the final time. Soviet artillery was already shelling the city center. The Red Army occupied the eastern suburbs. The end was measured in days, not weeks. Speer attended, made his appearance, played his role. According to his later testimony, the experience left him shaken and exhausted. The ritual celebration in the middle of apocalypse. The denial permeating Hitler's inner circle. He left Berlin that day and drove north to Hamburg, where he'd set up a mobile headquarters outside the city proper. Trucks, caravans, staff officers, and his personal bodyguard unit deployed in forest clearings. According to the timeline he later provided, the Greenland option was ready, or nearly ready. Supplies had reportedly been stockpiled at Travemünde. The aircraft were being prepared. Kernig and the other navigators claimed they had their flight plans finalized. But Speer hesitated. 3 days later, April 23rd, according to his memoirs, he made a bizarre decision. He flew back to Berlin. According to Speer's account, his adjutant, Manfred von Poser, secured a Fiesler Phi 156 Storch, a small liaison aircraft that could operate from improvised airstrips. They took off from near Hamburg and flew straight into hell. Berlin was under direct ground assault by this point. Soviet forces had penetrated the city proper. Street fighting raged across multiple districts. Why return? Speer later claimed he wanted to see Hitler one final time, to say goodbye properly. The Storch reportedly landed somewhere in the city center. Accounts vary on the exact location. Speer and von Poser were driven through burning streets to the Reich Chancellery and down into the Führer bunker beneath it. According to Speer's recollection, Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, probably the second most powerful Nazi after Hitler himself, intercepted Speer immediately. Bormann allegedly made a request: convince Hitler to leave Berlin, to fly south to Berchtesgaden, where he might continue directing what remained of German forces. Speer's meeting with Hitler reportedly lasted hours. He sat in on a military briefing where maps showed Soviet forces tightening a noose around central Berlin. When Hitler asked Speer directly whether he should leave for Bavaria, Speer later claimed he gave a strange answer. "Better to end it here, in Berlin, rather than some mountain retreat." Hitler seemed almost relieved. "That's what I thought too. But I wanted your opinion." Speer also stated, though some historians dispute this claim, that he confessed to ignoring Hitler's Nero decree, the scorched earth orders to destroy German infrastructure. According to Speer, Hitler let it pass without argument. They spoke again briefly around 3 in the morning on April 24th. Speer described Hitler's farewell as cold, distant. Speer and von Poser flew out of Berlin in the Storch as dawn broke. After leaving Berlin, according to Speer's memoirs, he stopped at an SS sanatorium where Himmler had set up temporary headquarters. The Reichsfuhrer SS was busy planning his own post-Hitler government. Speer claimed Himmler offered him a future cabinet position. Speer deflected non-committally and left. He returned to his mobile headquarters near Hamburg. Now joined by several additional officers, including General Otto Holzoya, reportedly sent by General Guderian with orders to protect Minister Speer. Also present, according to Allied intelligence reports, Oberstleutnant Werner Baumbach, commander of KG 200. The Greenland plan was apparently still live. The moment had come. But then Kernig, the navigator who'd spent weeks preparing the mission, got devastating news. Allied fighter bombers had hit the flying boats. Kernig initially told the Sunday Times this happened in early April, but that's almost certainly a memory error given his age. Luftwaffe records and Allied combat reports placed the attack on April 24, 1945. Hawker Typhoons from 439 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, struck BV-222 flying boats that had been moved to the Lake Plön area near Grand Admiral Dönitz's new headquarters. One aircraft was completely destroyed, possibly a second damaged beyond immediate use. The equipment Baumbach later mentioned to Allied interrogators, 6 months' worth of supplies carefully stockpiled, went up in flames or sank into the lake. According to Kernig's testimony, the plan didn't die immediately. One operational BV-222 remained at Travemünde. Crews worked frantically to get it flight-ready and began scraping together replacement supplies. But events were moving too fast now. May 1, 1945. Grand Admiral Dönitz called Speer by telephone. Hitler was dead. Suicide in the Berlin bunker the previous day. Dönitz was now Reich president under Hitler's last testament. Berlin surrendered to Soviet forces on May 2nd. That same day, according to Kernig, the base commander at Travemünde assembled all personnel. He told them the war was effectively finished. He handed out discharge papers, told them to go home. According to Kernig's account, the last BV-222 was rigged with explosives and destroyed to prevent its capture. Speer's escape route had been permanently closed. He joined Dönitz's short-lived government at Flensburg near the Danish border, serving as Minister for Industry and Production. When British forces entered Flensburg on May 23rd, 3 weeks after Germany's official surrender, they arrested the entire government. Soldiers took Speer into custody at Glucksburg Castle. His war was over. His reckoning had begun. Evidence and assessment. So what actually existed here? Multiple sources back up the basic framework. Speer himself admitted the plan to several historians and intelligence interrogators over the years. The details stayed consistent. Greenland, 6 months, returned to Germany afterward. Ernst Kernig's 2003 testimony provided independent corroboration from someone who had no apparent reason to lie. He wasn't seeking publicity. Reporters tracked him down. His specific details about aircraft, supplies, and preparations match both Speer's account and archival records. Archival fragments survive. Mission orders addressed to the Travemünde base commander referencing Arctic operations preparations. Allied combat reports document the April 24th attack on BV-222 aircraft at Lake Plön, exactly where Kernig said the planes had been moved. The technical feasibility is unquestionable. The aircraft had documented range and capability. German personnel had proven Greenland experience. The logistical framework was there. What's extraordinary is the psychological component. Speer genuinely seemed to believe, or at least claimed to believe, that disappearing for 6 months would somehow let him dodge justice, that the Allies would simply move on, that he could resume his life. The depth of denial, or perhaps desperation, required to pursue this plan reveals something profound about decision-making in extremis. Could the plan have succeeded? In narrow technical terms, getting to Greenland, establishing a camp, surviving 6 months? Possibly. The Germans had the equipment, experience, and expertise. But strategically, politically, legally, not a chance. Allied forces controlled Greenland. American reconnaissance aircraft regularly patrolled the coast. Even if Speer's group initially slipped through undetected, they couldn't stay hidden indefinitely. A camp of 30 Germans with aircraft would have been spotted within weeks, if not days. And the idea that Nazi leaders could simply resurface in October 1945 and face no consequences? That wasn't naivete. That was delusion bordering on psychosis. Yet the available evidence suggests the plan existed. Resources were committed, aircraft prepared, supplies gathered. In the final analysis, the Greenland operation reveals something historians often overlook about the Third Reich's collapse. The complete break from reality that gripped even its most intelligent and capable leaders as the end approached. Speer commanded slave armies and managed an industrial empire. He understood logistics, production, military capability, but he couldn't grasp that the world he'd helped build was gone forever. That's the real story behind the Arctic Gambit. Not whether the plan could have worked technically, but what it reveals about the human capacity for self-deception when confronted with inescapable consequences. The full story of Albert Speer, including his mysterious death in London in 1981, decades after Nuremberg, remains my ongoing research focus. This Greenland episode is just one thread in a much larger tapestry. If you found this interesting, consider supporting the channel. Links below. And remember, history's most compelling stories aren't always the ones everyone knows. Sometimes they're hidden in declassified files, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Thanks for watching.